my fiancé laughed. "I could do better than you any day." So I let her try, by introducing her to my loser brother who turned out to be a millionaire. The engagement ring she returned? Now on his wife's finger. I never thought those words would come out of someone I planned to marry, but when they did, everything changed. What started as love ended as a lesson in knowing your worth. I met Cassandra 3 years ago at a charity fundraiser for the local children's hospital. I was there because our school required teacher volunteers. She was there representing her pharmaceutical company. She caught my eye immediately, confident, polished, the kind of woman who commanded attention when she walked into a room. I was grading papers at a corner table during a break when she approached me, curious about what could be more interesting than the silent auction. Math tests, I told her with a smile. Apparently more exciting than bidding on spa packages. She laughed, and we talked for 2 hours about everything except work. That was Cassandra at her best, genuinely interested, intelligent, with this infectious energy that made mundane conversations feel electric. By the end of the night, I'd completely forgotten about the stack of algebra quizzes waiting at home. Our first few months together were honestly perfect. She'd text me during my lunch breaks, surprising me with coffee between classes, even helping me set up interactive lessons for my geometry students. I loved watching her passion when she talked about her sales targets and client relationships. She was ambitious in a way that inspired me, always pushing herself to achieve more. Sure, she'd occasionally joke about my summer vacation lifestyle, or tease me about needing to get a real job someday, but I thought it was harmless banter between two people with different career paths. She seemed to appreciate my stability, especially after dating what she called a string of immature guys who couldn't commit to anything beyond next weekend. I represented something different: reliability, emotional maturity, someone who actually planned for the future. The engagement happened during our 3rd Christmas together. I'd been carrying my grandmother's vintage engagement ring for 2 months, waiting for the perfect moment. It was a beautiful 1940s piece, white gold with intricate detailing that you don't see in modern jewelry. When I proposed at the same park where we'd had our first real date, Cassandra said yes, but her enthusiasm felt measured. "It's vintage," she said, examining the ring closely. "Very unique. We might want to get it appraised, maybe updated with a more contemporary setting." Even in that moment, I convinced myself she was just thinking practically about modernizing a family heirloom. I wanted to believe her hesitation was about honoring my grandmother's memory while making the ring her own. Looking back, I realized she was already calculating whether it was impressive enough for her social media announcements and office parties. Living together revealed more about her priorities. She'd critique our apartment's modest furnishings, suggesting we needed investment pieces that reflected our upward trajectory. When colleagues visited, she'd apologize for our temporary lifestyle, promising we'd upgrade once I figured out my career direction. The way she said it made teaching sound like a placeholder job rather than my actual profession. I started noticing how she'd light up around her pharmaceutical industry contacts. Doctors, executives, anyone pulling serious money. She'd become animated discussing their vacation homes and luxury cars, then grow quiet when conversation shifted to my classroom stories or student achievements. Her Instagram posts gradually featured less of us together and more of her professional networking events, always captioned with phrases like "surrounding myself with successful people" or "inspired by ambition." The pharmaceutical industry events became her obsession. Every conference, networking dinner, and company party was an opportunity for Cassandra to mingle with what she called real professionals. I'd watch her transform at these gatherings, suddenly more animated, more flirtatious, more everything when surrounded by doctors and executives earning triple my salary. She'd introduce me as "my boyfriend Mitchell, he's a teacher," with this apologetic tone that made it sound like a condition requiring sympathy. The worst part wasn't her embarrassment about my career, but how completely she'd change around wealthy men, becoming this version of herself I barely recognized. Her laugh got higher, her stories more embellished, her entire personality shifting to match whatever she thought would impress them most. Dr. Harrison became her favorite topic of conversation. He was a plastic surgeon who'd been pursuing her since joining her company's medical advisory board, and Cassandra mentioned him constantly. "Harrison just bought a yacht," she'd say over dinner. "Harrison's considering a practice in Beverly Hills. Harrison thinks I should consider medical device sales, much more lucrative than my current position." The way she said his name carried this reverence, like she was discussing someone vastly superior to mere mortals like me. When I'd point out that she seemed pretty interested in this Harrison guy, she'd laugh it off. "Oh please, he's just a friend." But you have to admit, that's the kind of ambition I find attractive. Someone who really goes after what they want in life. Her comments about my teaching became increasingly cutting. "Must be nice having summers off while the rest of us work year-round," she'd say when I'd mention vacation plans. "I wish I could have a job where I'm done by 3:30 every day." When I'd explain that I worked evenings grading papers and weekends developing lesson plans, she'd wave dismissively. "That's not real work, Mitchell. That's just busy work. Real professionals don't get 3 months off to find themselves." The irony was that she'd originally claimed to love my work-life balance, saying it would make me a great father someday. Now that same quality was evidence of my lack of drive, proof that I was settling for mediocrity while others built empires. Social media became her weapon of choice for subtle humiliation. She'd post photos from pharmaceutical industry events with captions like, "Surrounded by such inspiring, successful people tonight," while I sat at home grading trigonometry tests. Pictures of expensive restaurants would appear with tags like, "Finally experiencing how the other half lives." Places she'd gone with colleagues while I worked late at parent-teacher conferences. She'd share articles about entrepreneurship and financial success with pointed comments about knowing your worth and refusing to settle for less than you deserve. The message was crystal clear. I was the settlement, the compromise, the safe choice she was making until something better came along. The breaking point started building during her company's annual conference in Miami. She'd been excited about it for months, not because of the professional development opportunities, but because Harrison would be there presenting his research. "It's going to be such a great networking opportunity," she told me while packing clothes that seemed more appropriate for a singles cruise than a medical conference. "I really need to make connections with the top performers in the industry." When she returned 3 days later, she was different, more distant, more critical, more convinced than ever that she was wasting her potential by staying with someone who lacked ambition. She'd taken dozens of photos with various doctors and executives but sent me exactly 2 texts the entire trip, both asking how my little students were doing. The dinner party was supposed to be a celebration. I'd finally gotten approval for the advanced mathematics program I'd been proposing for 2 years, something that would benefit our brightest students and potentially attract grant funding for the school. I invited a few close friends over to share the news, including my colleague Sarah and her husband Tom, plus Cassandra's friend Amanda from work. I'd made my grandmother's lasagna recipe, opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving, and honestly felt proud of what I'd accomplished. It wasn't a promotion that came with a massive salary increase, but it was meaningful progress in my actual career, something that would impact hundreds of students over the coming years. Cassandra had been drinking steadily throughout dinner, making increasingly snide remarks about our apartment's furnishings. "I keep telling Mitchell we need to upgrade this place," she announced while gesturing dismissively at my second-hand dining table. "You can't expect to host proper dinner parties with furniture that looks like it came from a college dorm." Sarah tried to change the subject by asking about the new math program, but Cassandra cut her off. "Oh, that's just another unpaid responsibility they're dumping on Mitchell. More work for the same pathetic salary." The way she said pathetic made everyone at the table uncomfortable, but I tried to laugh it off, suggesting maybe she'd had enough wine for the evening. That's when she exploded. "Don't you dare patronize me," she snapped, her voice suddenly sharp and cruel. "I'm sick of pretending this is acceptable. Look around, Mitchell. Look at this sad little apartment with your sad little teacher salary and your sad little dreams of making a difference." The room went completely silent. Tom actually stopped chewing mid-bite, while Amanda stared at her phone like she wished she could disappear. "I could do better than you any day," Cassandra continued, her voice getting louder and more vicious. "Do you have any idea what kind of men are interested in me? Real men with real careers who don't need summers off to feel fulfilled. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as she kept going. Harrison makes more in a month than you make all year. He has a house in the hills, drives a car that costs more than your annual salary, and actually understands ambition. I'm settling, Mitchell. I'm settling for someone who's beneath my league because I felt sorry for you. Sarah's face had gone pale, while Tom just stared at his plate. The humiliation wasn't just mine anymore. She was making our friends witnesses to something that should have stayed private. The only reason I'm still here is because you're safe and convenient while I build my real career. But don't think for a second that this is permanent. I stood up slowly, feeling strangely calm despite the devastation. I think you should leave, I said quietly. The entire table was watching us now, and I could see the shock in everyone's faces. Cassandra looked surprised, like she'd expected me to fight back or beg her to stay. What? She said, suddenly seeming to realize she'd gone too far. I'm serious, Cassandra. You should go. She laughed, but it sounded forced and bitter. Fine. Maybe I will. Maybe it's time I stopped wasting my time with someone who has no ambition. She stood up unsteadily, walked to our bedroom, and came back with the engagement ring. Here's your grandmother's outdated little trinket, she said, throwing it at me hard enough that it bounced off my chest and clattered onto the hardwood floor. When I find someone who actually deserves me, I'll make sure to get something from this century. She grabbed her purse and walked out, slamming the door so hard that my neighbor's dog started barking. The silence that followed was deafening. 2 weeks later, I was getting coffee at my usual spot downtown when I spotted Cassandra at a corner table, looking smaller than I remembered. She'd clearly been waiting for me. My morning routine was predictable enough that anyone who knew me could intercept me here. When our eyes met, she looked genuinely nervous, fidgeting with her phone and avoiding direct eye contact. Mitchell, she said as I approached reluctantly. I was hoping I'd run into you. Can we talk? Her voice carried none of the vicious confidence from the dinner party, replaced instead with something that sounded almost vulnerable. I sat down across from her, curious despite myself about what had prompted this apparent change of heart. I've been thinking about what happened, she started, her words careful and measured. I was drunk, I was stressed about work, and I said things I didn't mean. Terrible things that don't reflect how I really feel about you or our relationship. She reached across the table like she wanted to touch my hand, then seemed to think better of it. I miss us, Mitchell. I miss our quiet Sunday mornings and the way you'd help me prepare for presentations. I miss feeling stable and secure instead of constantly chasing something I'm not even sure I want. It was a decent apology, the kind that might have worked if I hadn't seen her true colors so clearly revealed that night in front of our friends. I listened without interrupting, watching her cycle through what seemed like a rehearsed speech about temporary insanity and work pressure. When she finished, I nodded thoughtfully. You know what's interesting about timing? I said. My brother Jamie is actually visiting from Portland this week. He's the one I've mentioned before, the family free spirit who never could hold down a real job. Cassandra's expression shifted slightly, clearly wondering where this was heading. Based on everything you said the other night about the kind of man you're looking for, I think you two might actually hit it off. He's exactly the type of guy you described wanting. Someone who thinks big and goes after what he wants in life. What Cassandra didn't know, and what I had no intention of sharing, was that Jamie had always been the family's black sheep for completely different reasons than she'd imagined. While I'd gone the traditional route of college and steady employment, Jamie had dropped out junior year to pursue what everyone called his computer nonsense. 4 years, he'd lived in a studio apartment, working odd jobs while coding in his spare time, driving our parents crazy with his refusal to get serious about his future. He'd founded some tech startup that the family honestly didn't understand, talking about algorithms and user interfaces while we all secretly worried he'd never amount to anything stable or respectable. The twist that made this meeting so perfectly ironic was that Jamie's computer nonsense had actually made him incredibly wealthy. He'd sold his company 2 years ago for an amount that still seemed surreal when I thought about it, but he lived so modestly that most people had no idea about his financial situation. He drove a 10-year-old Honda, wore thrift store clothes, and rented a modest apartment because he preferred simplicity over ostentation. Our family knew he was doing well, but even we didn't fully grasp the extent of his success until he casually bought our parents a house last Christmas, paying cash without making it seem like a big deal. I'd love for you to meet him, I continued, watching Cassandra's face carefully. He's everything I'm not: unconventional, risk-taking, always chasing the next big opportunity. He actually just got back from some business trip to Japan, something about international expansion possibilities. I was laying it on thick, but not lying exactly. Jamie had been in Japan, though it was more of a vacation than business. He'll be at Brewhouse tomorrow night around 8 if you want to stop by. Casual introduction, no pressure, just thought you might find him interesting given your apparent preferences for ambitious men. The irony was delicious. I was essentially offering her exactly what she thought she wanted, knowing she'd completely misjudged the situation based on surface appearances. I arrived at Brewhouse 15 minutes early, positioning myself at a table with a clear view of the entrance where I could watch the evening's entertainment unfold. Jamie showed up right on time, looking exactly like what Cassandra would dismiss as another underachieving hipster: worn jeans, vintage t-shirt, canvas sneakers that had seen better days. He grabbed a craft beer and joined me, completely unaware of the setup I'd orchestrated. "So this mysterious woman you want me to meet," he said with his usual easygoing grin. "Should I be worried that my big brother is trying to play matchmaker?" I just smiled and told him to trust me, that he'd find the evening interesting if nothing else. Cassandra arrived 20 minutes late, probably to make an entrance, wearing a designer dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent. I watched her scan the bar until she spotted me, then noticed her expression change when she saw Jamie. The disappointment was immediate and obvious. Here was another loser, like me, someone who clearly didn't understand how to present himself properly or invest in his appearance. She approached our table with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mitchell, hi. And you must be Jamie." Her tone was polite but dismissive, the same voice she'd use with service workers or anyone else beneath her social consideration. Jamie, bless him, was completely oblivious to her condescension and genuinely tried to engage her in conversation. He asked about her work, listened attentively to her pharmaceutical industry stories, and seemed genuinely interested in her perspective on healthcare marketing. But Cassandra was clearly going through the motions, answering his questions while obviously calculating how quickly she could escape this waste of her valuable time. "So what do you do in Portland?" she asked with barely concealed disinterest. "Tech stuff mostly," Jamie replied with characteristic understatement. "Software development, some consulting work. Nothing too exciting." I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing at how perfectly he was playing into her preconceptions. The turning point came when Jamie casually mentioned his recent trip to Japan. "Business or pleasure?" Cassandra asked, probably expecting another disappointing answer about budget backpacking or teaching English abroad. "Little of both," Jamie said, pulling out his phone to show photos. "I was looking at some potential investment opportunities in Kyoto, but honestly spent most of the time checking out temples and trying authentic ramen." Her interest sharpened slightly when he mentioned investments, though she still seemed skeptical that someone dressed like a college student could be involved in anything serious. "What kind of investments?" she pressed, her tone becoming more calculating than conversational. That's when Jamie made his first casual reference to serious money. "Real estate development mostly, some tech startups that caught my attention. I've been diversifying my portfolio since liquidating my last company." He said it so matter-of-factly that it took a moment for the words to register with Cassandra. I watched her face change as she processed what he'd just revealed. This scruffy guy in thrift store clothes had sold a company and was now playing with investment money. "You sold a company?" she asked, trying to sound nonchalant while clearly recalculating everything about him. "Yeah, a couple years ago. Nothing huge, just a software platform I'd been working on since college. Got lucky with timing and found the right buyers." The transformation in Cassandra's behavior was absolutely fascinating to observe. Within minutes, she went from barely tolerating Jamie's presence to hanging on his every word, asking detailed questions about his business experience and investment strategy. Her body language shifted completely, leaning forward instead of checking her phone, maintaining eye contact instead of looking around the room, laughing genuinely at his jokes instead of offering polite smiles. When Jamie excused himself to use the restroom, she immediately turned to me with barely contained excitement. "You didn't tell me your brother was an entrepreneur," she said accusingly. "Why didn't you mention he'd sold a company?" I just shrugged and said I figured she'd find out if it mattered to her, watching her realize that she'd almost dismissed exactly what she claimed to be seeking. Over the following weeks, Cassandra launched what could only be described as a full-scale campaign to win Jamie's attention. She'd show up at places she knew he'd be, always dressed impeccably and armed with conversation topics about entrepreneurship and investment strategies she'd clearly researched online. I watched from a distance as she transformed herself into whatever she thought he'd find attractive, suddenly interested in tech startups, craft beer, and sustainable living because Jamie had mentioned those topics. Her Instagram feed became a carefully curated display of intellectual interests and sophisticated hobbies, complete with posts about reading business biographies and attending networking events for young entrepreneurs. Jamie, to his credit, was initially charmed by her apparent enthusiasm for his world. He'd always been attracted to driven people, and Cassandra's pharmaceutical sales background gave them common ground to discuss business development and client relationships. But he wasn't stupid, and her sudden transformation didn't go completely unnoticed. "Your ex is certainly intense," he mentioned to me after their third coffee date. "She seems really focused on understanding every detail of my business dealings. It's flattering but also kind of exhausting." I just nodded sympathetically, letting him draw his own conclusions about her motivations. The truth started becoming clearer during a dinner at an upscale restaurant that Cassandra had suggested. Jamie later told me how she'd spent the entire meal asking increasingly specific questions about his net worth, investment portfolio, and long-term financial plans. When he'd casually paid the $300 bill without looking at it twice, her entire demeanor shifted into what he described as predatory mode. She'd become more physical, touching his arm constantly, making suggestive comments about successful men being attractive, and even mentioning how much she valued financial security in a relationship. It felt like being interviewed for the position of her personal bank account, Jamie said with obvious discomfort. Meanwhile, I was getting regular updates from mutual friends about Cassandra's behavior in social settings. She'd started name-dropping Jamie constantly, referring to him as my tech entrepreneur, and making sure everyone knew she was dating someone successful. Amanda, her pharmaceutical colleague, mentioned that Cassandra had been researching startup valuations and venture capital trends, clearly trying to educate herself enough to sound knowledgeable in Jamie's circles. The irony was that her obvious calculation was making her less attractive, not more, to someone who'd grown up wealthy enough to recognize gold-digging behavior from experience. The breaking point came when Jamie decided to introduce Cassandra to his social circle. He'd been reconnecting with Elena, a woman who owned an independent bookstore downtown and had been part of his friend group for years. Elena was everything Cassandra wasn't: genuinely interested in ideas over income, comfortable with herself without needing external validation, and completely unimpressed by wealth or status symbols. When Cassandra met Elena at a group dinner, the contrast was immediately obvious to everyone present. While Elena engaged in thoughtful conversations about literature and social causes, Cassandra kept steering discussions toward business success and financial achievements. "It was actually painful to watch," Jamie told me later. Cassandra spent the entire evening trying to establish some kind of hierarchy based on income and career status, while Elena was just being herself and connecting with people as human beings. He described how Cassandra had made several condescending comments about Elena's bookstore, suggesting that retail was quaint, but not particularly ambitious, clearly trying to position herself as the more suitable partner for someone of Jamie's caliber. "That's when I realized what you'd been trying to show me," Jamie said. "Cassandra doesn't actually care about me as a person. She cares about what I represent financially." He'd started pulling back from their relationship immediately, spending more time with Elena and less time responding to Cassandra's increasingly desperate attempts to secure his commitment. 6 months later, I opened my mailbox to find an elegant wedding invitation with Jamie and Elena's names embossed in gold lettering. The ceremony would be held at a small vineyard outside the city, Exactly the kind of intimate, meaningful celebration that reflected their values rather than their bank account. I called Jamie immediately to congratulate him, genuinely thrilled that he'd found someone who loved him for exactly who he was. "Elena's incredible," he said, his voice full of the kind of happiness I'd never heard from him during his brief involvement with Cassandra. "She doesn't care about the money at all. Half the time I think she forgets I have any, which is exactly how I want it to be." The wedding day was absolutely perfect, small, personal, focused on family and close friends rather than impressing anyone with extravagance. Elena looked radiant in a simple vintage dress that probably cost less than one of Cassandra's typical dinner outfits, but she glowed with genuine joy in a way that made every expensive gown pale in comparison. During the reception, Jamie pulled me aside with a small velvet box. "I wanted to ask you about this," he said, opening it to reveal my grandmother's engagement ring. "I know how much this meant to your family, and Elena fell in love with it when I showed her the photos. Would you mind if we used it? It feels like it should stay in the family with someone who'll actually treasure it." I felt my throat tighten unexpectedly as I looked at the ring that had caused so much drama just months earlier. "She'd be honored to wear it," I managed to say, meaning every word. When Jamie slipped the ring onto Elena's finger during their private moment after the ceremony, I watched her face light up not because of its monetary value, but because of the family history and love it represented. "It's the most beautiful ring I've ever seen," she whispered to Jamie, clearly moved by the gesture. "Your grandmother had excellent taste." The contrast with Cassandra's reaction, calling it an outdated trinket, couldn't have been more stark. Through mutual friends, I learned that Cassandra had heard about the wedding through social media posts from attendees. Apparently, she'd spent the evening calling various people trying to get details about the ceremony, the venue, and especially Elena's background. When she discovered that Elena owned a small independent bookstore and lived in a modest apartment above the shop, Cassandra's reaction was reportedly one of complete bewilderment. "I don't understand," she'd said to Amanda. "Why would someone with Jamie's money choose a woman like that? She doesn't even have a real career." The fact that Jamie had chosen substance over status, genuine connection over calculated ambition, seemed to genuinely confuse her. I found peace in knowing that my grandmother's ring was now with someone who understood its true value. Elena wore it not as a status symbol or social media prop, but as a symbol of the love and commitment she shared with Jamie. Their marriage was built on mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of authentic connection that no amount of money could buy or fake. Meanwhile, Cassandra remained single and increasingly bitter, having learned nothing from her experience except that she'd somehow been cheated out of what she felt entitled to receive. The final twist of justice came a year later when I ran into Cassandra at a downtown coffee shop. She looked tired, older somehow, wearing designer clothes that seemed more desperate than confident. "Mitchell," she said with forced brightness, "I heard about Jamie's wedding. I hope they're happy together." Her tone suggested she hoped nothing of the sort. "They are," I replied simply. "Elena's wearing our grandmother's engagement ring. It looks perfect on her." The look that crossed Cassandra's face was worth every moment of humiliation she'd put me through. She'd rejected that ring as worthless, and now it adorned the hand of the woman who'd won the man she'd thought she could easily claim. "I always knew that ring was special," she said weakly, but we both knew she was lying. As I walked away, I felt genuinely grateful that she'd shown me her true character when she did, saving me from a lifetime of feeling inadequate for someone who would never appreciate what really mattered.